Hi, I'm James Higgins, better known as OG Skeeter Rabbit. The OG had to be added because down through the years, there's been some unauthorized use of my name. I've been around locking since 1971, and most of you that are dancers out there know that Don created his first locking move in 1970. So I've been around it almost since the very beginning of locking, 6 decades. I started the website Locker Legends in 2003 because there was the opening of the internet and social media on the internet at that time, but there was no representation of the real history of locking. The history was told by the people that had become famous in locking, the Lockers, the Electric Boogaloos, and anybody that had become famous and had access before the internet gave access had given their rendition of what locking history really was. And I was shocked and surprised as an old investigator and an old locker from that far back as to what the stories were and what was told and what the history actually was. Because a lot of it that I saw, I never lived. I lived a different story in locking, and I began to tell that story and elicit for people that had come along on that journey with me to have a format to be able to tell their story. So I was very fortunate to be able to have access at that point in time to the internet, to be able to put Locker Legends website together and eventually Locker Legends Facebook page together. I'm an old school dancer from way back in the day. And that's me, OG Skeeter Rabbit, when I was in the heyday of the locking dance world in 1971. Well, through all of those years in internet exposure, it's come just about time for me to move on. But there's a lot of interviews and a lot of stories that have never been told that I didn't tell. There was a lot of politics in locking as it became from what is a street dance, a cultural street dance that was emanating on the streets of Los Angeles and Compton and Watts and Inglewood that transpired all the way to a stage performance. But the stories that weren't told were a lot of the behind the scenes stories as we begin to struggle to go from a regular street dance where there were no money, no payments, nothing, into a field in which there were a lot of promises and offers made. A lot of you have known down through those years, these last decades, the controversy and struggle between what is authentic and what isn't authentic. You also know that there's a struggle between the group, the Lockers, that have made it to the highest pinnacle of a commercial performance, and the actual street dance itself that made it that way. Well, somewhere in the future, I'm going to talk about style versus cultural art form. But this video is to let you know that for this month, I'm going to air a lot of those uncut interviews and uncut videos. And I'm going to tell some of those real stories that I experienced, the real stories as I saw them from a young teenager trying to develop my own established name and reputation in a growing street dance world in Los Angeles, all the way to James Higgins, the detective investigator that went back in his life to take a look at those things. I'm going to talk about it from the standpoint of the stories that existed, and I'm going to talk about it from the standpoint of the culture and the background and what it really meant to African Americans and the other people that were exposed to it that became so involved in locking that could feel what we call the real funk and soul of locking. So this month I'm going to go back to those stories and I'm going to talk about it. The first story that I'm going to start with is, and we're going to take a look at it here, is why was there so much dissension within the Lockers group and how does it affect locking today? Well, I believe it's because there were so many violations of the street code. Once it became where people were interested in it as a commodity, they had no concern with the street code. They had no concern with the friendships. They had no concern with the rules of the streets. They wanted to monetize it. And you know, as young dancers, a lot of us went along with that monetizing of it. A lot of us didn't even know how it disrespected some of the history in the African American community. We were concerned about what people saw as success. And what people saw as success did not always correlate with the street code. You see, the street code is the origin and roots of what drove the creation of its own culture. It is what drove the African American community to create its own because of exclusion. And what do I mean by exclusion? Well, you have to go back and look at the era from the 1950s to the 1960s and how the 1960s influenced locking, influenced Soul Train, influenced the message of dance, influenced the African American hairstyles, afros, how the Johnsons and Johnson's products, Magnificent Brothers and hair products stepped up to actually sponsor Soul Train. You have to look at all of that to understand why the street code was so prevalent to the power of locking. Now, today, a lot of people don't want to look at that. The reason why is because the easiest way for them to become famous is to have no rules. And that means to even disregard the rules of a cultural art form. When you have no rules, you're free to do what you want to do and call it authentic. Well, as much as I dislike saying this, that's one of the controversies between the lockers and locking. Because when Don Campbell created locking, he had very few rules, no rules. He was the first to create it, and he created a step that allowed that to take place. But as locking developed into a cultural art form, there were rules. You couldn't go into a club and do anything you wanted. Let's say like Reagan did in the Olympics and be accepted. But that's exactly what happened when you have an audience that don't know what the rules are. There was a clownism that came into locking that did exactly what it wanted, and people took it as authentic. Today, that doesn't fly like that because it is a culture that has offended a lot of people when people do not follow the roots and the street codes of the dance. I'm not going to go too deep in it. This is just my first initial show to let you know that what we're going to do is some of those old videos where people talk and they talk candidly. I'm going to expose. You say, why now? Because it's time for old OG Skeeter Rabbit to turn this thing over to another generation. I've traveled the world teaching, and everywhere I've went, they'll tell you I taught the cultural art form of locking. I did not just go out and show people how to imitate me or to do my moves or anything. Very rarely talked about me. I talked about the cultural art form and the many, many, many people, the many, many, many crews that started at the very origin of locking, that made it possible for it to integrate to Orange County, that made it possible to integrate to the Valley, that made it possible for people all over the country to see and imitate the style of locking to what their interpretation of it was. But I'm here to tell you now that the true interpretation from the streets was much deeper than what was publicized by the commercial world. So stay tuned this month before I move on from social media. And we now turn the Locker Legends Facebook page in the history of locking. Stay tuned so that you can see some of the things that never been seen, and seen some of the controversial things that's never been talked about. You know, my philosophy is that toes were meant to be stepped on. And if you don't step on it, nobody will ever feel what should have been felt. I'm going to end this with my saying, educate before you recreate, because there's a world out there that when you pass on and preserve others' culture, you assure that your culture will be preserved too. Thanks so much. This is OG Skeeter Rabbit in the last days of Locker Legend on Facebook and in social media, telling you, stay tuned, because we're going to rock the house. Peace. OG, the original Skeeter Rabbit, signing off and out.